Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on plant-based diets. Is it all health? Is it all hype? My name is John Redenberg. I am a dietitian in the Employee Wellness Program at UF Health Jacksonville. So I welcome you, those that are in Jacksonville or in Gainesville or all parts of Florida. And I think you'll find with today's talk, the answer is it depends. And I think you can have that same two-word answer with a lot of nutrition questions. When we look at trying to determine what could be healthy for us and what could be unhealthy for us, a lot of context is important. So when we look at the issues behind plant-based diets, I'm going to share with you some of the research based on plant-based food consumption and let you make some of your own conclusions. But by and large, what we know about plant-based diets is that they can be a very important component of a well-balanced meal plan. And some of you might be aware, March is National Nutrition Month, and one of the key themes for National Nutrition Month this year is sustainability. And when we look at advocating for plant-based diets, we do know, independent of any health attributes, we do know this type of approach to eating does lend itself to more environmental sustainability, which can be a very important part and a very important reason to choose the food that we eat each day. So today, I want to give you a chance to ask any questions that might be on your mind. So feel free to drop those in the chat or unmute yourself, and we'll try to make sure we get each of those questions addressed. And then at the end, I'll also drop a copy of each of these slides that I'm sharing with you too. But basically what I want to talk about today is a little bit more about how to define a plant-based diet, share with you, of course, some of the benefits, what some of the research shows about health outcomes, as well as protein alternatives. When we look at plant-based eating, we've seen a pretty big explosion of non-meat based food choices. So we think Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger, those might be some of the more processed protein alternatives that come to mind. So I'll share with you some of the nutritional attributes of these food choices and let you determine whether or not it could be a healthful choice for you and your family. And then lastly, we'll finish up by talking about taking practical steps to looking into more plant-based eating for yourself and for your family. But first, let's just start off with a definition. And when we look at plant-based eating, there's not a universal definition, but by and large, when we talk about it in the context of today's webinar, we're looking at approaches that focus on whole grains, focus on beans, nuts, seeds, and of course, fruits and vegetables. When we look at a plant-based diet, we're also trying to minimize the consumption of those processed foods, added sugars, and those saturated fats. So by and large, when we're looking at a plant-based diet, it doesn't mean it's exclusively vegetarian, but it does mean we want to try to shift our focus by building our plates and our meals around more fruits and vegetables and other plant-based foods. When we look at the benefits of plant-based eating, well, first, actually, let me give you a definition in terms of basic vegetarian diet overview. So if we look at the different approaches to healthy eating, each of those pictured on your screen there, whether it's vegan, which is exclusively plant-based, ovo-lacto vegetarian, which features a combination of offering some milk and eggs and cheese as part of that vegetarian diet. Then there's the pescatarian, or you might also see it referred to as pesco-vegetarian, which is basically a vegan diet plus fish. And then omnivore. So this is basically eating everything that doesn't eat you first. So that could be a combination of plants and animals. So somewhere along that spectrum, when we look at plant-based diets, more traditionally, we're emphasizing vegetarian approaches, but a plant-based or a plant-forward diet could easily include fish, eggs, milk, cheese, as well as small amounts of beef and chicken. So that's where it gets a little bit of a gray area when we're trying to really narrow down what could be the beneficial components of plant-based eating. A lot of the research on plant-based diets are what are known as observational studies. So it's tough to draw a direct cause of a specific chronic condition or prevention of a chronic condition because we're not accounting for other variables as well. So these observational studies The correlation and cause aren't always one and the same, but we have seen more and more observational studies that show plant forward or plant-based approaches to eating are associated with improved health outcomes. We do know this, independent of any research, when we're looking at plant-based diets, they're typically more nutrient dense. So we see a greater amount of vitamins and minerals, which helps our immune function, helps keep our mental focus where it needs to be, keeps our energy level stable, and by and large might help us feel a little bit better mentally. The other benefit that we see, which I think is a very important and understated benefit, and that is the presence of dietary fiber. So we all know about dietary fiber in terms of regularity, but dietary fiber also helps promote favorable gut health, which has been linked to a lot of underlying issues such as high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. With a plant-based diet, you're looking at maybe anywhere from 20 to 30 grams per day, depending on the types of food choices selected, whereas a typical American diet may only provide half that amount of dietary fiber each day. So most Americans aren't meeting their fiber needs because, let's face it, most Americans aren't getting adequate fruits and vegetables in their diet. And then the other benefit, as I said before, independent of nutrition, we do see a reduced environmental impact. So if we're looking at sustainability of our food supply, plant-based eating is going to be a key attribute of that. Lots of benefits from a plant-based diet. There are some potential drawbacks. So when we look at these drawbacks, it all depends on the type of plant-based eating that you're engaged in. So again, more towards that plant-based end of the spectrum where it's exclusively vegan, that can be a little bit more challenging because you might be giving up some of your favorite foods if you're a big fan of steak or chicken. Again, remember, plant-based is not equal vegan, so they're not exactly identical. But one of those potential drawbacks, if you are deciding spontaneously to adopt a vegan diet, it can be challenging to give up some of those favorite foods that you have been raised on. The other potential issue that we see with a vegan diet, okay, so a well-planned vegan diet, you're going to typically be able to meet all of your nutritional needs for your vitamins and your minerals, including protein and including iron, with one exception, and that is B12. So B12 is found exclusively in animal foods, but we can also get amounts of B12 in fortified cereals and foods, as well as mushrooms. So when we look at vegan diets, we're looking heavily on those two categories, the fortified foods and fortified cereals, as the primary source of vitamin B12. There's another issue that can happen if we're transitioning to a plant-forward approach to eating. Could have some digestive issues. So as I said before, typical American diet is much lower in dietary fiber than what's thought to be beneficial for us. If we increase our fiber intake through the more inclusion of fruits and vegetables, this can lead to some digestive issues as we're bringing more fiber into the intestinal tract. So oftentimes, if I'm counseling people who are looking to adopt more plant-based approaches to eating, I also try to make sure that they're getting their fluid needs met each day. And roughly, if you take about half your body weight in ounces each day, that's a good guideline in terms of total fluid intake. The other thing that you might notice is if you start to adopt a more plant-forward approach to eating without any help with recipes or meal planning, you might notice you're wasting a little bit more food, at least initially, because of course, fruits and vegetables and those types of foods are a lot more perishable. So if we look at some of the best diets out there, and there's all kinds of lists out there. If we look at the US News and World Report, their best diets, things like you see the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, the flexitarian diet. The common denominator in many of these quote unquote best rated diets are plants. So plant-based eating, that's a key facet of many of these leading dietary programs. But I also want to caution you that really the best diet for you and your family is the one that's both sustainable and helps you meet your own personal health outcomes. So when we look at it in the context of plant-based diets, Yes, plant-based foods can be part of a well-planned nutrition program, but it's not good nutrition if nobody eats it. So you want to make sure you're paying very close attention to the happiness portion of your diet. Is what you are eating making you happy and keeping you healthy? Because if it's not going to be sustainable for you. There's many different approaches to healthy eating. There isn't one size fits all. Not everyone has to follow the Mediterranean diet or the DASH diet or a flexitarian diet, whatever it might be. There is an individual approach that's going to work best for you and your family. And that's where talking to a dietitian here at UF Health could be very advantageous for you. One of the things that we have seen, and really kind of the thought process between the title of this talk when we talk about health or hype, is that you do see a health halo kind of cast over a lot of plant-based approaches to eating. Everything's plant-based. So plant-based this, plant-based that, but it's not necessarily synonymous with nutritious. And a good example here, all the snacks you see on the screen right there, Oreo cookies, Doritos, Fritos, Nutter Butters, Sour Patch Kids. These are all technically plant-based snacks. So of course, they are not, of course, the most nutritious choices. So remember, although you'll see products marketed as plant-based, manufacturers aren't really saying that these are any better for you nutritionally than something else. And that's one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind as you start to look at ingredient and food labels for some of these products. But just remember, plant-based and nutritious are not synonymous. They can be in many instances, but not always. All right, so let's take a look at some of the true health benefits of plant-based approaches to eating. And when we look at the health benefits, as I said, there's some word of caution here. These are a lot of observational studies, and I'll share with you the references at the very end if you want to do some more digging into that research. But let's start with something I think is a big issue for many of us and is one of the leading risk factors for heart attacks and strokes, and that's high blood pressure and hypertension. So when we look at a plant-based diet, there's several mechanisms by in which they might help with blood pressure. First, helps improve the vasodilation, so basically helping improve blood flow throughout those vessels. We do know, of course, greater antioxidant content with plant-based approaches to eating can also help modify blood pressure. The other thing that we get from plant-based diets that we don't always get in a more animal-focused diet is greater intake of dietary potassium, which is a very important mineral for blood pressure management. The other mechanisms by which we see improvements in blood pressure through plant-based diets could be from improved insulin sensitivity. So helping the own insulin that you manufacture and make work a little bit more effectively and thus helping maintain better and improved blood sugars. We also see a decrease in blood viscosity, meaning, your blood is, kind of able to pass more easily through your blood vessels and therefore reducing the stickiness that can be a precursor to hardening of the arteries. And then the other part here that we're starting to learn more and more about is the plant-based approaches to eating really modify our gut microbiome. And it's thought that the metabolites of a lot of these sources of dietary fiber specifically have mechanisms outside of the intestine that seem to help lower blood pressure. So we're still, recovering more information about that, but it just goes to show you just how potentially helpful dietary fiber is to our overall GI health, but also for our blood pressure too. So that's what we know in terms of blood pressure benefits. The other thing that we see with a plant-based diet is really important in terms of dietary cholesterol. And then there's a couple of different food parts at play here when we look at helping improve cholesterol. First, plants like beans and oats have greater amounts of soluble fiber. And what happens when we eat soluble fiber? It binds to cholesterol particles in our intestinal tract and just flush it right out of our body. The other nutritional component that's of note when we look at plant-based food choices are phytosterols. So these are naturally found in plants, and these also compete with cholesterol for absorption and seem to lower the total cholesterol in our blood. That number in terms of a quantity of phytosterols based on research seems to be about 0.6 to 1.1 grams per day. At least in research, that's been shown to drop bad cholesterol by 5%. Now, what does that look like in real food terms? Most of your good sources of phytosterols, like your plant oils, your nuts, your seeds, beans like kidney beans and whole grains, are giving you anywhere from about 40 to 100 milligrams per serving. So again, you can see how combinations of these food choices, not in one dose, but combinations of these food choices can give us a very therapeutic amount of phytosterols, which can help improve blood pressure. And I think that number is important when we look at the amount that's been shown to lower bad cholesterol, because what we've seen through a lot of manufacturing practices, you'll see the marketing of phytosterols in a lot of products as a way to help basically get you to buy more of it. So if you have that number in mind, you can actually look and see something that's fortified with phytosterols and ask yourself if this is really going to be any therapeutic for you, or any therapeutic amount for you. So something to consider when we're looking at food labels in the grocery store. But again, I'll be happy to answer more questions about that at the end. There's two other areas which shouldn't be a surprise to you when we look at lower rates of disease with relationship to plant-based diet. And one is obesity, and the other is diabetes. So we've seen that a whole food plant-based diet, so when I say whole food, I mean we're minimizing those ultra processed foods. So of course, things like Cheez-Its and Oreos are plant-based, but those aren't necessarily whole foods. So these types of approaches to eating has been shown to achieve greater weight loss compared to any other trial that didn't limit energy or include exercise. So take a look at that. That's telling you something very powerful here. And again, I think a lot of this is attributed once again to dietary fiber. Including more plants makes us feel fuller longer, and is also going to help us with control of our hunger mechanism too. The other thing that we see is tied back to one of the mechanisms we saw with blood pressure, and that is improved insulin sensitivity. If we see improved insulin sensitivity, besides helping modify our blood pressure, we can also see a reduction in incidence of type 2 diabetes. This is still in a formative stage, if you will, when we look at some of the research, but it's still noteworthy nonetheless. So we look at all these health outcomes, and we know that there's a lot of publicity now with plant-based diets, and it's kind of been given a health halo, so to speak, where if we just call something plant-based, it just appears to be healthy. But this is where you need to do a little bit more digging on your own behalf in terms of what's going to work best for you and your family. And let's talk about that in the context of some of our plant-based alternatives. So let's start with dairy. So if you go to the grocery store now, you'll see all kinds of different milk varieties out there. It used to be just cow's milk, but now we got almond milk, soy milk, cashew milk, coconut milk, oat milk, hemp milk, rice milk, milk made from ropes, milk made from staplers. I'm just making up some now just to get the idea of how extensive it is. But they all have a variety of different nutritional attributes. So when we look at what actually is the best of these, it is all going to be dependent on what you are looking for. So let's take, for example, one of the common ingredients that we find in cow's milk, and that is calcium. So are these milk alternatives better sources of calcium? Well, many of them, like almond milk and soy milk, are fortified with additional calcium. So that does make them somewhat equivalent. The other component that we see when we're comparing cow's milk or an animal-based milk to a dairy alternative is a higher amount of dietary protein. And many of these milk alternatives like almond milk, cashew milk, coconut milk, oat milk are very low in dietary protein. So on that basis of comparison, they may not be as adequate as animal-based milk. The one exception here typically is going to be most of your soy milk. So soy milk does have a very similar amount of dietary protein when compared to traditional cow's milk. But again, it also depends on what you like. You know, if you like the flavor of almond milk, you like the flavor of cashew milk or oat milk, and it works for you and your family, that's fine. We can get those complementary nutrients like calcium and protein from other food choices. So it's really, just like I said from the outset, is it healthier for you? It depends. But when we look at some of these products, look very closely at the added sugars, because there's so many milk alternatives out there that you see a wide variety of added sugar. And independent of what your nutritional goals might be, I do think it's wise for each of us to minimize our added sugar consumption. So take a look at that number specifically as you're evaluating some of these choices for you and your family. I've also listed some of the dairy alternatives for yogurt. The same rules apply. Just take a look at it from the label, assess the flavor. If this is something that's going to work for you, go for it. Some of the same limitations still hold true with regards to yogurt as it relates to some of the plant-based milks. So keep that in mind when we're trying to consider some of those snack choices. The other thing, and this is the one that I think is the most noteworthy, just because of some of the meat alternatives that are on the market now. So when we look at plant-based diets, as I said, if it's well planned, we can easily meet our protein requirement. Soy products like tofu and edamame are terrific sources of dietary protein. Lentils are probably one of the highest sources of dietary protein out there. Just 1 cup is 18 grams of protein, which is about the same amount that you get in 3 ounces of beef or chicken. Chia seeds, a couple of tablespoons of those will give you a little bit of dietary protein. And quinoa is one of the grains that have among the highest amounts of dietary protein. So there's a lot of meat alternatives out there that we can easily meet our protein requirements. But when we start to look at some of the processed alternatives out there, that's where I want you to kind of get your antenna up. Pay close attention to these nutrition labels, because I will argue on behalf of these Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers, they're not coming out and say that they are healthier than the regular ground beef, but they are presenting them as a plant-based alternative, which they are. Nutritionally, they stack up pretty favorably when we look at, not favorably, pretty comparably when we look at, let's say, the Beyond Burger versus the ground beef. Similar amounts of calories, it's very close to the amount of saturated fat, a little bit less protein, but look at that number at the very bottom there, the sodium. So the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, the Morningstar Farms, the Boca Burgers, these are all heavily processed plant-based sources of meat alternatives, if you will. So if you're somebody who is trying to manage high blood pressure, these are some choices that you have to be pretty mindful of. So again, it goes back to that previous slide. If I'm looking for something that is a little bit more healthful for me as a protein source, I would look at some of these choices as my primary source of dietary protein before I would consider any of these choices. Okay. I just like to look at this as a comparison. Okay. So again, I'm not ranking one ahead of the other, but we can see that the Beyond Burgers and the Impossible Burgers match up pretty closely to regular ground beef, but the key difference there is the dietary sodium. And I've tried some of these. I haven't tried this Boca. Well, maybe I have tried the Boca Burger, but I have tried Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger, and I don't know if anyone else out there has. And I tell you what, pretty close in flavor, when we look at it compared to beef. So I will say that. But again, we're not advocating these, nor are the companies advocating these as nutritionally superior to ground beef. They're just a plant-based version of it. So maybe environmentally better for you, but from a nutritional standpoint, it all depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to reduce sodium intake, then these plant-based burgers may not be the best choice for you. So as we wrap up and look at ways to consider plant-based approaches to eating, when I say health or hype, I do think there's a lot of health benefits to plant-based eating. Some of the hype encircles the health halo that we sometimes can be placed over those plant-based meat alternatives like the Impossible Burgers and the Beyond Burgers. But again, it all depends on what the goals are for you and your family. Since we do know that plant-based approaches to eating do have numerous health benefits, lowering our risk of chronic disease, how do you get started? Well, I think one of the easiest ways is just pick one meal each week to go meatless. So meatless Mondays, that's a common theme that many people will engage on. Try some new recipes. Look at meat maybe more as a garnish. So look at the portion size of what you're including for beef and chicken and ask yourself, do you really need 7 ounces or 8 ounces at a meal? Could you do well with 3 to 4 ounces, which is typically going to be more than adequate for most of us. And then start gradually. I'm going to share with you some recipe websites and information that you can kind of peruse for your own well-being and for your family, and to try some of those recipes and see what you can come up with. But I think starting gradually, knowing that plant-based approaches to eating can be very helpful for us without having to go exclusively vegan is a very important point to make. Anytime, though, we talk about embarking upon any dietary change, we want to make sure that you're talking with your doctor first. Okay, we don't want to say arbitrarily, hey, everyone just go follow a vegan diet. Just make sure you talk to your healthcare provider first. But here's some ideas to get you started. You don't have to write all these down. We'll send these slides out to everyone who's here right now. But again, just some pretty tasty and flavorful ways to make plant-based approaches to eating a little bit more appetizing, and of course, very nutrient dense for us as well. So if we're looking at trying to make a change, here's some things to consider. We already know that you don't have to go full vegan to get the health benefits. And I always try to say start small and still be mindful of those ultra processed foods. Try to minimize those as best as you can. And just remember that plant-based and healthy are not universally synonymous. They can be, but they aren't universally synonymous. All right, so I want to share with you just a few of the websites. Again, we'll get these links out there to you, but a couple of different resource groups out there, vrg.org. This is the Vegetarian Resource Group. This is their page right here. This link right here is actually a dietetic practice group. So this is the a practice group of vegetarian nutrition from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So although this is geared primarily towards dietitians, this particular page, the resources and links, has a whole host of different recipes and ideas. And then the Food Network also has a pretty good compilation of some vegetarian recipes. So again, some things to consider if you're trying to start small. Say, oh, you know what? I want to go meatless Monday. What could I eat? So you can look at some of the resources on this page here. And then, of course, on this page as well. So that takes us to the end of our discussion here today. I do thank you for your time. I'm going to be hanging out in this virtual lobby, answering any virtual questions you might have. So you want to type them in the chat, feel free to do so. And I do thank you for joining us.